let's get started. Welcome everyone to week 11. We're now going to be talking about violent offending. And so for today's lecture, we'll be covering a number of different themes. The first is just to give you a basic definition of what violent offending is and how does it differ from aggression. Then we'll talk a little bit about theories of violent offending. And we'll distinguish between two key types of theories. General theories, which say that we don't really need any specific unique explanation of violent offending. Theories of general offending can explain violent offending as well. We'll contrast those theories with specific theories that say that there is something unique about people that perpetrate violent crime compared to people who perpetrate other types of crime. Then we'll look at how we assess risk, and this is really key in the criminal justice system. So especially if you're going to go to law school, you're going to work in the justice system in some capacity, you're going to come across risk assessment tools. So we'll look at different philosophies surrounding risk assessment and talk a little bit about some real divides in terms of the types of risk assessment tools that are used. Then we'll talk about intervention strategies, how we treat and intervene with violence. We'll talk a little bit specifically about homicide offending. And I'll go back a bit and talk a little bit about some work that's been done by James Reed Malloy to look at warning signs or pathways into really serious and violent offending behavior. So when it comes to the distinction between violence and aggression has harm to others as its goal, whereas violence is any aggression where extreme harm is the goal. All forms of violence are aggressive, but not all forms of aggression are violent. Aggression can sometimes be socially or normatively valued, especially if we're thinking about behaviors like in sports, in hockey, football, particularly aggressive sports. There are examples of where aggression is promoted or where aggression is actually rewarded. There are also different types of aggression. I think I've talked about this in past weeks, about the distinction between instrumental aggression and reactive aggression. So hostile or reactive aggression is hot-blooded aggression. It's where individuals emotionally react to something that somebody else had done to them, and it sort of precipitates this act of aggression or this act of violence. On the other hand, instrumental or cold-blooded aggression is more calculated. It's more about gaining something of value, having a specific purpose for perpetrating this act of aggression. I tend to not like the dichotomous distinction between behavior as being either instrumental or reactive, so I like what Vitaco and colleagues did, where they developed an aggression scale to look at the degree to which aggression was instrumental or reactive. So this way we can look at, like mental illness, we can look at things along a spectrum. If a behavior was planned, goal-oriented, and unprovoked, then there would be more so evidence that the behavior was instrumental aggression. If it was free of anger and was directed at a stranger victim rather than somebody that they knew, that would be an indication that that person was engaging more so in instrumental aggression. But just because one of those things is present or one of those things is absent doesn't mean that it is definitely instrumental aggression or that it is definitely reactive aggression. So maybe especially in the tutorial discussion in the off-topic section, see if you can think about types of aggression that maybe are traditionally considered instrumental, but maybe there are certain examples where it might be classified as reactive aggression. Something that maybe we haven't answered is, why do we care? Why does distinguishing between instrumental and reactive aggression matter? It matters because, as we looked at last week, individuals with strong features of psychopathy tend to be cold and calculating, or at least at times are cold and calculating. Reactive aggression is more likely to be perpetrated by the average person involved in offending, whereas instrumental aggression signifies somebody who is maybe a bit more severe in their pattern of offending, maybe more likely to present with strong features of psychopathy. So from an intervention standpoint, we're more concerned about instrumental aggression than we are about reactive aggression. There could be some instances of reactive aggression that are more severe than some instances of instrumental aggression, but overall we're more concerned about instrumental aggression. So what do we know about individuals that perpetrate violence and who experience violence as victims? And here's one thing that's really important to acknowledge. There's a very clear overlap between being a victim of violence and perpetrating violence. these aren't distinct individuals. There's a lot of overlap. The people that perpetrate violence are very often the ones that are most at risk of experiencing violence victimization. When it comes to the perpetration of violence, males are far more likely to perpetrate violence than females. Victims and offenders both tend to be single and about the same age as well. And we also see that if it's a 25-year-old that's perpetrating the violence, the victim is usually around the same age as well. We don't see big distinctions between the ages of the individuals involved in the crime, whether it's on the victim side or the offender side. We also typically see that the victim and offender know one another. So they have had some form of prior relationship. It isn't that instrumental type of offense where the offender is seeking out some unknown but vulnerable victim. When it comes to the prevalence of victimization across males and females, if we look at violence excluding sexual offending, males are more likely to experience violence victimization compared to females. But if we include sexual victimization as part of violence victimization, males and females are about equally as likely to experience violent victimization. Other things that can contribute to being a perpetrator or a victim of violence include a person's routine activities. This is something that's been referred to in the literature as risky lifestyles. Going out late at night, drinking, using drugs, these are things that can increase the risk of experiencing victimization or perpetrating violent behavior. We also need to be careful with how we frame the relationship between going out at night and experiencing victimization, because this can lead to things like victim blaming, where somebody is faulted for going out or faulted for drinking. We don't want to do any of these things. People should be able to go and live their lives the way that they want to and not experience victimization. But what we do also need to acknowledge is that there are certain scenarios that can place others at risk of victimization, and communicating this to others can be important so that they at least can take steps, if they are going to go out, take steps to prevent them from experiencing victimization. Alright, so here we'll distinguish between general theories of violent offending and specific theories of violent offending. When it comes to criminology, criminologists typically endorse general theories. They believe that violent offending can be explained in the same way as non-violent offending. On the other hand, forensic psychology tends to emphasize that we need specific theoretical perspectives and specific risk assessment tools to explain violent offending compared to non-violent offending. And I tend to agree with forensic psychology, even though I am a criminologist, because I do see that individuals who have perpetrated violent offenses do tend to have a risk factor profile that's a little bit more severe compared to individuals that have not perpetrated violent offenses, or at least what I think is even more important, looking at the frequency of violent offenses. Because sometimes violent offending can emerge at random, but when it's consistently perpetrated over time by the same individual, that is usually associated with a specific risk factor profile. And I would say that psychopathy is one of the most important predictors of this continued perpetration of violence over the life course. But getting back to general theories of crime, so there are a couple that I'll touch on. One would be social learning theory. So if you'll recall Richard Ramirez, when he perpetrated a lot of his violent offenses, it was based on his association with his cousin Mike. Mike had gone to Vietnam and during the Vietnam War and perpetrated a lot of basically war crimes. He had committed sexual assaults against women and brought photos of these offenses back to show to Richard Ramirez, taught Richard Ramirez how to stalk people, how to hunt, how to use a knife, how to use other weapons. And so Ramirez was exposed to this form of deviant or criminal behavior. And proponents of general theoretical perspectives would simply say that Mike was an individual that taught Richard Ramirez that it was basically okay to violate social norms. They would say that Ramirez was exposed to positive reinforcements for engaging in generally negative behavior, and that's why Ramirez engaged in these violent crimes. It wasn't because he had a specific proclivity for violent offending compared to other types of offending. And they would point out how Ramirez also engaged in things like break and enters, which is a non-violent crime. And they would point to that an example of how these operant conditioning mechanisms, differential association, influenced Ramirez to just be generally delinquent. They would say that Ramirez learned to be violent the same way that he learned to engage in other types of criminal behavior. He was just simply receiving rewards for this involvement in crime. Control theories also tend to believe that the causes of violent offending are the same as the causes of non-violent offending. And Govison and Hershey's general theory of crime that we talked about in week 4 is a very good example of this. Govison and Hershey basically explained that low self-control causes all different forms of offending because it just makes an individual more impulsive, more risk-taking. They're going to act on the opportunities that are before them. They don't necessarily go seeking out violent offending specifically, but if they're in an environment more prone to allowing them to act on opportunities to engage in violence, then violence is going to happen. So for control theories, or for Govison and Hershey, violence involvement is really just a combination of impulsivity and low self-control and that opportunity to engage in violent behavior. So Govison and Hershey would say that if an individual has low self-control and has not been violent, it's more likely it's just been a case of them not having much of an opportunity to perpetrate violent behavior. There are quite a few different specific theories of violent offending, so some of these are from the textbook and some are the ones that I've come across in my own work that I think are particularly important to know. We'll start with the general aggression model, and this model tends to focus on the idea that we need to look at the intersection between how a person thinks and feels and how this intersects with their environments, the opportunities or the situational factors that might arise that can influence their involvement in a violent crime. So for example, the general aggression model would say that if an individual has a hostile attitude towards others, or is an individual with like fragile masculinity or feels the need to prove themselves, if they're out at a bar, maybe they wouldn't otherwise be engaging in violence, but what if somebody bumps into them and other people see this? Do they feel the need to get retribution? So that's that situational element. Normally they're not always acting out on their violent tendencies, but when certain situational factors arise, then they're going to engage in violent or aggressive behavior. And we'll see this in intimate partner violence if the partner has a specific attitude about what the other partner's role in the relationship should be. If they have, for example, patriarchal views of what should be the role of women in the relationship, if they perceive that this role isn't being met, maybe they're going to be violent in this particular instance when there's that situational factor present. Other people can generally not be very aggressive, but when they feel extreme levels of stress, they'll experience that difficulty controlling or managing emotions, and that's when they're going to become involved in violent behavior. Wickstrom's situational action theory is fairly similar to the general aggression model. The emphasis here is on different conditions that are going to influence involvement in violent crime, specifically propensity. So propensity can be things like features of psychopathy or low self-control that are going to influence offending, and then also situational factors. So to this point, it's very, very similar to the general aggression model. But what Wickstrom also adds in is the lack of a deterrent factor. So when there's no capable guardian there, nobody there to intervene, or maybe they feel that there's no police around, no cameras around, and so they're more likely to be able to get away with their involvement in this particular violent crime. Martin Lelumiere, who did his research at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, he focused on describing what he referred to as young male syndrome as one type of individual that's going to be involved in violent crime. And for him, this type of individual was just trying to demonstrate their masculinity. They're kind of young, they're trying to figure out their role in life, and they use their ability to fight, or they use violence as a tool to help construct their identity. But eventually when they enter adult roles, they get a job, they have a wife, children, and so on, they're going to age out of this behavior. So that young male syndrome type that Lelumiere was referring to is very similar to Moffat's description of adolescence limited offending. Lelumiere also came up with another type that was called the disadvantaged male. And this was kind of similar to Moffat's life course persistent offender. The disadvantaged adult male is somebody who has just constantly gone through life with an inability to get ahead or to even just make ends meet. So they're the individual with that neuropsychological deficit and family adversity. They do poorly in school, they don't get along with peers, they probably have low self-control, teachers find it difficult to deal with them, and so on. And so for this individual, they really don't have an opportunity to reach their goals through legitimate means, so they'll turn to violence as a coping strategy or as a way to obtain the means that they're seeking, because they might lack education, they might lack these different skill sets to get the things that they want in legitimate ways. Where Lumiere differed from Moffat was in his specification as well of basically the psychopath type violent offender. For the individual with psychopathy, it was actually that they didn't necessarily have a disadvantage, and they weren't just doing violence as part of their identity or as part of their adolescent limited offense. For them, it was a strategy of getting what they wanted, so it was more instrumental violence perpetrated by this group. So now for a topic that I think is particularly important because it plays a big role in the forensic psychology department here at SFU, and that's violence risk assessment. So we'll talk about some of the instruments that are used as part of violence risk assessment and some of the controversies and disagreements in this area of research. Throughout the history of risk assessment, we can identify 3 distinct approaches. The first is unstructured clinical judgment. And this was used basically from the dawn of time, from the time at which people would actually be interviewing and assessing offenders to find out the risk of offending, up until about the 1970s, 1980s. For unstructured clinical judgment, it was basically the idea that the person assessing the individual, so the clinician, the forensic psychologist, is an expert. They know what they're doing, so they should just go in there and interview the individual, rely on their expertise, and then communicate to a judge whether they think that this person is a high risk to reoffend or not. The unstructured clinical judgment approach was really all about using intuition, prior experience, expertise, and training to make decisions about whether somebody was at risk of continuing to offend or not. So this process was used for a long, long period, and finally, especially in Canada, people say this doesn't seem to make sense. This doesn't seem ethical. Marnie Rice and Vern Kinsey, who were clinical psychologists in Ontario, they said we need to come up with a more structured approach to assessing risk for offending. So they developed what we would call actuarial risk assessment. And this is the idea that research is used to figure out what are the key risk factors for offending, and we will not consider any other factors other than the risk factors identified by the statistical analysis to matter for reoffending. So with actuarial assessment, the way it works is the researchers, we will maybe begin a study of 500 individuals, and they will look at a whole bunch of different risk factors, maybe 50 risk factors that they think might be relevant. They'll enter all of these risk factors into a statistical model and then find which of these risk factors are the top, let's say 10, the top 20 most strongly related to the prediction of future offending. So they'll take those top 20 risk factors, and those will be the risk factors that a clinician is required to assess for as part of their risk assessment. They will not look at any other risk factors. A clinician can't look at risk factors and think, I don't think they really are that high risk, or maybe I think they're really high risk, and then go about altering their score. According to actuarial risk assessment, this is something that absolutely cannot be done. There is no deviation from a person's score. Structured professional judgment tries to take a blend of the unstructured clinical judgment and actuarial risk assessment. Like actuarial risk assessment, the SPJ approach will rely on a set of risk factors that are identified as important to the prediction of offending. In contrast to the actuarial assessment, instead of relying on statistical analysis, structured professional judgment selects risk factors based on a review of relevant literature. So it will comb through a whole body of literature on, let's say, the prediction of violent offending, identify risk factors that seem to be important to the particular population of interest, and then include those in the risk assessment tool. Where structured professional judgment also differs from actuarial and becomes a little bit more like unstructured professional judgment is that the structured approach also allows the risk assessor to vary the person's score. So remember, with actuarial assessment, the score is the score. They wanted to get rid of clinical judgment altogether. The SPJ approach says, like, well, there can be certain circumstances in which certain risk factors might not apply. Or for this particular individual, maybe there were risk factors to their offending that are not really common amongst other people, so maybe that risk factor wasn't included in the risk assessment tool, but it's relevant to this person. So the structured professional judgment approach allows the assessor to actually change a person's rating. It's called a professional override, and they have to explain why it is that they are using this professional override. While this sounds like a pretty good idea, I always thought it seems like it would make sense. Research testing situations in which people have engaged with that professional override have found that using the professional override actually weakens the prediction or our accuracy of predicting who is more likely to continue to offend in the future. And so there's a lot of controversy and debate about whether actuarial or SPJ approaches are more appropriate. One of the problems with actuarial risk assessment tools, for example, the ones that have been created by Marnie Rice and Vern Kinsey, are that they rely on a very specific sample. I'll talk now about the Violence Risk Assessment Guide that was developed by Kinsey and Rice. The VRAG, like most other actuarial risk assessment tools, includes only static risk factors. So if you'll recall, a static risk factor is a risk factor that cannot be changed. So it's something that they have a history of and there's no way to remove that history. So for example, things like having a prior history of violent offending, having a prior history of failing to comply with court orders, these would be examples of static risk factors that might be included in a risk assessment tool. So to create the VRAG, Kinsey and Rice basically collected a sample of about 500 individuals that were in the psychiatric ward of a federal custody center. So basically these were individuals that had committed a sentence for which they could receive 2 or more years in custody, and they had a major mental illness that was contributing to their involvement in an offense. And they used this sample to create the VRAG. The big question that we have to ask is, does that mean that the VRAG will be generalizable to people who don't have a major mental illness, or who are not in a federal custody center, so they committed less serious offenses? The sample for the VRAG were all basically white males. So will this type of risk assessment tool be generalizable to individuals, say, from an indigenous background, or a Southeast Asian background, or to women? And we've seen actually some pretty major court cases, Ewart versus Canada being one of them, where the court has basically determined that these actuarial risk assessment tools should not be used by the government because they lack reliability and validity, or at least we failed to establish that they are reliable and valid for groups that are not white males. So this is where the VRAG runs into a bit of controversy, because the SPJ approach relies on a review of the literature as opposed to a specific sample. So the SPJ approach might be more generalizable. Here is another example of something that has resulted in controversy with respect to the use of the VRAG. So you can see on the screen here an actual VRAG test, and you can see where it's a question about the type of violent offense that the individual has committed. You can see the different options and the degree of injury that the victim experienced. And then next to each option, you can see a score. And you can see scores of higher or lower. Here you can see that if the offense resulted in death, the individual actually scored lower. They got a -2, a lower risk rating. Similarly, if the individual is married, they get a lower risk score. If the individual has a history of schizophrenia, they get a lower risk score. For thinking about violence towards women, this is a really concerning risk assessment tool, because it's basically saying that if an individual is married, they're less likely to perpetrate violence. But we know that intimate partner violence is one of the types of crimes that is very likely to go unreported. the VREG has been set up to basically ignore theory. It's also been set up to ignore the importance of exposure time. So why do you think death of the victim would result in a lower score on the VREG? The reason is because the individual that commits a homicide offense is going to spend more time in custody, meaning that they have less of an opportunity to continue to offend during that period of time. And so if you follow them up over 5 years and you don't account for exposure time, they will appear to be less likely to reoffend. But it's only because they've lacked the opportunity to continue to offend because they've been incarcerated. They are not out in the general public. So these are some of the issues with the VREG and with actuarial risk assessment that the SBJ approach tries to address. One of the tools that is part of the SBJ approach, one of the first SBJ tools that was developed right here at SFU, is the HCR20. And the HCR portion stands for historical, clinical, and risk. What these historical factors are the static risk factors. The clinical risk factors are the factors that are referring to dynamic risk factors, things that can change. And then the risk side of things is focusing on risk management. How likely do we think that this individual is in terms of actually responding to treatment? What is their prior history of response to supervision under the justice system? And like I mentioned before, because it's an SBJ tool, it will include that professional override. So it includes 20 items, 10 static, 5 clinical, 5 risk management, and how the authors of the HCR20, which include Kevin Douglas and Steve Hart, how they came to arrive at these factors was based on a systematic review of the literature. And they did this to avoid coming up with key risk factors based on a small segment of the population. So it's thought to be a little bit more generalizable. We'll move along now to intervention strategies. And there are 3 types of intervention strategies that you need to know for the final exam: primary, secondary, and tertiary intervention strategies. Beginning with primary intervention strategies, the focus here is on being proactive. Target of this intervention are not individuals actively involved in offending. The target here would be children or youth that are at risk of, say, joining a gang, or who are demonstrating problems in school and teachers are worried that they might drop out or might be associating with a negative peer group. So they're looking to target sort of vulnerable or at-risk youth that are not yet involved in antisocial behavior. So this will take a multifaceted approach that tries to provide support at not just the individual level, so not just treating the individual, but looking at their family, community, school environment, and trying to improve all aspects. So it can often be called like a wraparound approach, trying to figure out how do we make sure we improve not just this individual's own risk factors, but maybe their family functioning or their behavior at school, or looking at community triggers that could influence their involvement in future antisocial behavior or violent offending. Common intervention strategies at the primary intervention level include multisystemic therapy, which is really where you involve both the child and their family, begin to understand the family dynamic at home to try and get the individual to stop offending. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which we've talked about before, just trying to rewrite scripts in a person's head. For example, for this kid, if they're being frustrated because they can't complete some work in the classroom, how do they deal with that frustration? How do they ask a teacher for help instead of acting out? A specific example of a program that kind of blends cognitive behavioral therapy and multi-systemic therapy that was developed right here in Canada is called the Stop Now and Plan program, or SNAP. And it focuses on at-risk kids and helping them deal with their thinking styles, finding ways to calm down, get self-confidence, that belief that they can solve the problem, and the steps that they can take to solve these problems. One of the challenges with primary intervention strategies is getting the family to buy in. The most at-risk kids tend to have the most at-risk families. So how do you convince, say, a parent who is an alcoholic or struggles with substance abuse or has a parenting strategy that is kind of very negative? It's going to be like a authoritarian parenting strategy and they don't see a need for intervention. They don't want to engage in treatment. So these families might not participate or might be more likely to drop out. So the highest risk kids might be the ones that we have the greatest difficulty in reaching. One example of a primary intervention strategy is David Olds' nurse-family partnership, and this is conducted in Michigan. It might have been in Flint, Michigan. It's a primary intervention strategy that helped about 80,000 at-risk mothers improve their parenting behaviors. And the results showed that children that were part of this program showed improvements in educational outcomes. They avoided involvement in criminal behavior. And by about the year 2031, the projection is that this program will have prevented 90,000 violent crimes from occurring. So it's a very cost-effective program that is reducing a lot of serious harm in the community. Secondary intervention is for kids that are maybe involved in a first criminal offense. So in the justice system, often we want to divert these individuals from the formal justice system because of labeling effects, state-dependent effects that could further amplify their likelihood of involvement in criminal behavior. So these secondary intervention strategies are like an alternative to dealing with the individual through the formal justice system, where the aim of the intervention is to prevent the reoccurrence of behavior. Primary intervention, the goal is to prevent the individual from ever engaging in criminal behavior. With secondary intervention, it's how do we stop this behavior from ever repeating in the future? How do we stop the individual from escalating towards a more serious type of behavior? The types of intervention strategies are the exact same as in primary intervention, looking at things like cognitive behavioral therapy and multisystemic therapy. However, it's just that the target is different. The subject of the intervention is the individual that has actually now perpetrated a particular type of criminal behavior. Tertiary intervention strategies are used for those individuals that are at the deep end of the criminal justice system, the ones that have repeated involvement in offenses or are involved in really serious offenses. The tertiary intervention strategy is a lot like how treatment providers approach substance use treatment. It's a harm reduction strategy. So the goal is not just to try and get an individual to stop offending altogether, but rather, how do we get them to slow down in their criminal behavior? Or even a successful tertiary intervention strategy might just get the individual to commit less serious crime. This isn't to say that the treatment strategy says, hey, go commit minor theft and not assault. But they're recognizing that positive change can include going from more serious forms of offending to less serious forms of offending. Here we're trying to minimize risk and maximize protective factors or add strength of protective factors. And this is a strategy that can be done in custody or in the community. Those are the different intervention strategies, but what about the actual treatment styles, about what goes on in those intervention strategies? As you can imagine, there are two perspectives. The general treatment perspective says that how you try to get someone from stopping to offend violently is how you would try and get someone from stopping to commit a break and enter or to stop from stealing motor vehicles. Whereas others are saying, no, we need very specific types of intervention strategies for violence. The latter perspective is a perspective endorsed in Canada's criminal justice system. There are specific violent offender treatment programs that are used to try and respond to the anger, the violence, the aggression of individuals who have perpetrated offenses like homicide and, say, sexual assault or rape. These strategies can also focus on trying to teach empathy and morality. There are some problems with this, however, and one of those problems can include parroting. Parroting, not parenting, but like Paul, I want a cracker, parroting is where the individual is actually just regurgitating information that they've learned through participation in treatment. So they might learn that it's good to show empathy or that it's good to show remorse. So they'll get up in front of a judge and they'll know that, hey, if I say that I feel really badly for my crime, then I'm going to get a lesser sentence. So they just say all the right things, they don't actually feel those things. So does treatment actually work? The answer appears to be yes, but there's such a wide range in the quality of treatment as well as the quality of the research investigating the treatment that it's often very difficult to say. We also have to be careful about what types of treatment is being conducted because some forms of treatment can be very harmful. One of these types of treatments is called attachment therapy. Don't get this confused with attachment theory based on things like Mary Ainsworth's attached child, whether the child is afraid in new or strange situations. Attachment therapy is basically about removing all choice, all decisions from the child. They are not allowed to get a glass of water on their own. They have to ask for permission. If they're throwing a tantrum, the attachment therapy response is to literally sit on the child or hug them or hold them and not allow them to move until they've calmed down. And this type of treatment strategy has actually resulted in the death of children who were held or sat on by adults and they suffocated and they died. This is why I constantly emphasize in this class and try to get you to read peer-reviewed empirical articles, because this is the type of research that we need to make sure that we're doing the right types of treatment. We can't just walk into a custody center and decide that we want to do some random type of a treatment strategy that we think might be useful. Before we start the treatment in properly, we need to test it out, we need to study it, evaluate whether or not it's actually working so that we can say that our treatment is evidence-based. When we're talking about violent crime, I think what people are often very interested to know about it are homicide offenses, and so I'll talk a little bit about this. Pictured here you can see several individuals that are relatively infamous Canadian homicide offenders. The top left you can see Karla Homolka, who you share something in common with Karla. And some of you will hopefully end up the same as Karla Homolka. Don't worry, I'm going to explain why. She has a degree in criminology from the University of Ottawa. So while she was in prison, she actually studied criminology, which I'm not sure is necessarily the best thing, especially when we think about the story I told you about Kayla Bork, who was taking criminology classes like forensic criminology because she wanted to learn about how to better hide bodies and things like that. At the top, kind of in the middle there, you can see one of the Bacon brothers and Matthew Johnson, who are responsible for the Surrey 6 shootings. On the very right, you can see Robert Willie Picton. In the middle there, you can see Clifford Olson. I'm going to tell you a story about Clifford Olson. So my dad actually met Clifford Olson. Not just that, but my dad was actually picked up by Clifford Olson in Clifford Olson's car while my dad was hitchhiking. So my mom and dad dated in high school, but my mom moved to Vancouver and my dad lived in Prince George. So my dad and his friend would hitchhike from Prince George down to Vancouver. And so this was back in, I don't know, the 70s or something like that. So maybe hitchhiking was more common then than now. And they got picked up by a bunch of different people, and finally they were close to around the Hope Merritt area. And they got in a car of a guy who had already picked up another couple. It was this French-Canadian couple. And the guy in the front seat who was driving, later we would learn is Clifford Olson, was being really vulgar towards this French-Canadian couple, talking about menage a trois and these sort of rude things that he was saying to them, telling them that they had to pay for his lunch and his gas and things like that. My dad and his friend just got this very eerie vibe from this guy. And so my dad and his friend told this guy, they were at the gas station and the guy was standing outside the car. And my dad and his friend said, if you don't give that couple their money back, we are going to beat you up and lock you into the trunk of your car, and we'll let the police know, but it's a long walk to the police station, and so you might be sitting in that hot trunk all day. So the guy looked into his trunk for quite a period of time, and my dad thought that he actually had some sort of weapon in the trunk, but basically shut the trunk, said fine, and gave the couple their money back, and they went on their way. And it wasn't until 15, 20 years later where Clifford Olson was back in the news because he was doing what was called a cash. The news, this is kind of not a very sensitive term, but the news was calling it a cash for bodies scam, where Olson was basically telling police that he would only tell the police where bodies of his child victims were if the police agreed to give his wife, I think it was like $50,000 per body. So it was back in the news, and my dad saw this face and immediately recognized that it was Clifford Olson. I have a connection with the individuals at the bottom left of your screen, Cruz Wellwood and Cameron Moffat. I can't tell you anything about them, but they were actually kids that I interviewed while they were in custody because they had perpetrated a very violent sexual homicide offense against a young girl named Kimberly Proctor. So these are the types of Canadian homicides that come to mind, the ones that get a lot of media attention. And what I want to communicate to you is that this is not what the typical homicide offense looks like. The typical homicide offense is a manslaughter offense, which means the individual did not intend to kill that person. So usually homicide offenses are reactive violence, not instrumental violence, or at least if it was instrumental violence, the individual meant to just hurt or assault the person. They didn't mean to kill the person. The types of homicides that we most regularly hear about are usually the homicides that are least typical. And so it's very important that we don't listen to these atypical homicides and then make conclusions about what the average homicide is like, or that we know what homicide offenders typically look like. An example of a local case that we'll talk about, and it's been featured in a lot of different documentaries, is called the Abbotsford Killer, known as Terry Driver. Terry Driver was responsible for brutally assaulting Tanya Smith and Misty Cockrell. Tanya Smith died and Misty Cockrell was able to survive and call for help. What was interesting about Driver was that he would actually be taunting police during the investigation of the crime, and he brought a lot of fear to the Abbotsford community because he threatened to commit future crime. His cockiness was actually what led to him getting caught, because he made these calls to police and police broadcasted these calls to the general public, made the phone call records known so people could listen. And one person actually detected the voice. Actually, two people detected the voice. Driver's brother and Driver's mother. Fortunately, they actually contacted police and they were able to get a copy of Driver's fingerprints, and they were able to match those fingerprints to fingerprints left at the crime scene, and they were able to capture Driver. Why this case is particularly important for criminology students and law students is because the courts determined that Driver was a dangerous offender. All of the expert witnesses basically agreed that this individual, Terry Driver, had deep-seated behavioral problems, demonstrated antisocial personality disorder, and was a high risk to continue to offend. So Canada brought in what's called dangerous offender legislation. What this means is that Crown Counsel can at any point in time, so even after the case has been processed, they can apply to have an individual designated as a dangerous offender. Lyon vs. the Queen, 1987 case in Canada, clarifies the purpose of dangerous offender legislation. It says that dangerous offender legislation is clearly designed to segregate a small group of highly dangerous criminals posing threats to the physical or mental well-being of their victims. So it's not just about what they did in the past, it's about what they're believed they're going to do in the future, and then it allows the courts to give the individual the status of a dangerous offender, and they have what's called an indeterminate sentence. They will only be released when a group of experts believe that this individual no longer poses a risk to the public. A lot of people, for good reason, have a difficult time understanding how could somebody get to a place where they would actually kill another person. And so to make sense of this, words that often come to mind is that this individual must have been psychotic or mentally disordered. Maybe they were a psychopath, cold-blooded. They must have been gang involved or had access to guns, or were terrorists or were involved in a school shooting or mass shooting. Unfortunately, homicides are more common in these very atypical cases, and we need to begin to understand that not all homicide offenders are these truly evil individuals that we could never imagine coming into contact with ourselves. We'll take a look at some of the core facts about homicide. Since the 1970s, and especially towards the end of the 1980s, homicide rates have really been decreasing. The reason for the decrease, especially strong decrease after the 1980s, was related to the crack epidemic, especially in New York and other parts of the United States, where there was a lot of gang-related violence, a lot of violence in the streets that was leading to homicide offenses. But again, these were not necessarily planned homicide offenses, not the offenses of cold-blooded murderers, but more offenses about gang involvement and offenses about territory and drugs, or violence between drug users and drug dealers. We know that just like violent offending in general, males are more likely to be victims of homicide and more likely to commit homicide. Victims are more likely to be killed by someone they know, so they're less likely to be killed by a stranger, though this has decreased somewhat since the 1980s. Most homicides are not first-degree homicides. Most homicide are manslaughter offenses, meaning that they were not planned. And just like violent crime in general, victims and perpetrators of homicide tend to be on the younger side. As I mentioned with respect to the crack epidemic and its influence on violent crime, in the United States, in the Washington, D.C. area, almost half of homicides were drug-related. So we can really see how the war on drugs and maybe why legalization or decriminalization of drugs is important, because it could reduce the amount of homicides that we see in our communities. If you ever get a chance to watch The Wire, it's a phenomenal depiction of drug use culture, drug dealing culture, and how this can lead to increased involvement in homicide by people who aren't, again, those mentally disordered individuals or psychopathic or cold-blooded. There can be individuals just caught up in the culture of violence. Homicides are most likely to occur during the months of July and August, on holidays, on weekends, during evening and night hours, and in large urban or metropolitan areas. The reason why this is the case is because the times at which people are more likely to go outside. Does going outside make you at risk of perpetrating a homicide offense? No, but the increased number of people outside, especially in warm weather, is also associated with things like drinking, and that can increase the risk of perpetrating violent crimes, including homicide. So we have to be careful about how we interpret some of these details. It's not as if warm weather is causing people to commit homicide. We can also see that there's a very strong correlation between ice cream sales and homicide. Does that mean that eating ice cream makes you a homicidal maniac? I don't think so. Ice cream is more likely to be sold in the months of July and August. Hotter, that brings more people outside, more likely to be drinking outdoors, indoors, in bars, getting out. People have more unstructured free time, and that's what can lead to the perpetration of violence. How do we explain homicide offenses? Well, early theories kind of look like what the media looks like or presents now. They focus on things like psychopathy being quote-unquote maniacal, cold-blooded, psychopath, psychotic homicide offenders. More contemporary-ish theories have emphasized things like the drug-related influence on violent crime and homicide, where we can see gang involvement, neighborhood violence, fighting over territory or turf can all lead to homicide offenses. For example, when it comes to the drug trade, we can see homicides perpetrated between rival drug dealers, or homicides perpetrated by a drug dealer against a drug user over a debt, for example, or a homicide perpetrated by a drug user over a drug dealer over the quality of the drug that was sold. More recently, there's been a focus just on general explanations of homicide offending, where individuals that live risky lifestyles, so they have low self-control, they drink, they use drugs, they associate with delinquent peers, they're going out and they're constantly committing crimes. It just exposes them to increased opportunities that one of these violent crimes is going to result in death. Because again, manslaughter is the most common type of homicide offense. It's a violent offense that went horribly wrong. Talked to a kid, never had any violent crime history prior, but he was at home and he had had his bike stolen a couple of days earlier, and some kids at the skate park said that they saw a homeless man riding around on his bike. So he grabbed his skateboard, went to the skate park, His friends chased this guy to a gas station, and he grabbed his skateboard and he hit this guy over the head to try and get his bike back. Obviously the wrong thing to do. But he wasn't trying to kill anyone. He wasn't by nature a violent person or a really antisocial kid. He hit him with a skateboard and the person died, and he went to jail for it. These are unfortunately relatively common instances of the types of kids that I would see when I was interviewing homicide offenders. I have examples of kids that were cold-blooded, committed horrific offenses and knew exactly what they were doing. But I have more examples of kids who were trying to start a fight, and that fight just ended in a way that they had never imagined leading up to that perpetration of their crime. So that's a lot of theory talk thrown at you. I'm going to talk a little bit more about theory, but I think it's a little bit more interesting because we can begin to see how these theories apply to actual cases. So we're going to look at warning signs for serious violent offending. So this isn't your regular assaults. This isn't your average manslaughter case. This is now the types of crimes that maybe you have more of an interest in, more of the types of crimes that are depicted in the media, and we'll try to make sense of these types of offenses. One of the things that criminologists don't do a very good job of is focusing on really serious and violent offenses. Remember that I mentioned that criminologists were, especially in the past, coming from a more sociological perspective, focusing on less serious forms of crime that could be explained from more of like a rational choice perspective. What this does is it ignores those less typical crimes that are more severe, that don't necessarily seem very rational. So we often have to look more towards psychology to really begin to understand involvement in very serious and violent crimes. And we'll take a look at some of the models, or one particular model that can be used to apply to the most serious types of offenders. The model that I'm talking about is Reed-Malloy's pathway model, or warning behaviors. The pathway model that I'm talking about is Reed-Malloy's warning model for serious and violent offending behaviors. And Reed-Malloy is very interesting because he's a clinical psychologist, forensic psychologist, that does research but also has a lot of practical background experience. He's been a consultant to the FBI's counterterrorism division. He's been responsible basically for evaluating the severity and the certainty of threats to the royal family. He was a consultant on CSI and an expert witness in the Oklahoma City bombing trial that involved the offender Timothy McVeigh. Reed-Malloy's warning behaviors identify a series of stages that an individual goes through prior to their involvement in a really serious and violent offense. We're not talking about crimes like aggravated assault or manslaughter. We're focusing on usually offenses that involve bombing, shootings, multiple victims, and usually homicide is the result or the attempted intent of the individual perpetrating this type of attack. Individuals go through these stages linearly, so it begins with a pathway warning behavior where they begin to enter into this stage of being interested in getting back at someone, seeking revenge, or so on. Then the fixation warning is when the individual really begins to focus on a specific group of people, event, or scenario. Identification warning behavior is really about how the individual sees themselves. Novel aggression is where they sort of test out their ability to engage in violent crime. And then the energy burst is when they are about to engage in the criminal behavior and they begin to get that sense of adrenaline. Leakage warning behavior is when the individual might let somebody know, such as the police, that they're about to engage in this criminal behavior. And then the last resort is where they sort of identify that they have to go through with the attack, and they'll actually directly communicate to somebody that they're going to engage in this attack. But we will spend some time going through each of these in a little bit more detail in terms of how they have related to prior serious and violent offenders. Beginning with that first stage of pathway warning behavior, this is like a pattern that defines any behavior that's part of research, planning, or preparation to actually implement an attack. So they might begin to do research online, they might begin to train by using firearms, they might begin to work out go to the gym, buy guns, surf the internet to understand how to build a bomb. These are all these sort of initial warning behaviors that an individual might partake in before they engage in a serious and violent event. Fixation warning behavior is behavior that indicates increasingly pathological focus or preoccupation with a person or cause. So they might begin to really spend all of their time on Reddit surfing a specific subreddit, or Stormfront is known as sort of a haven for right-wing extremists. Individuals will begin to spend all of their time on these types of websites, or reading, or spending time with this particular type of group. So it can be measured by increasing sort of perseverance on the person or cause that they're fixated on. They become much more opinionated. They're unwilling or unflinching in their opinion that certain sets of ideas are actually factually accurate. They begin to negatively characterize the object of their frustration. These fixations can actually impact a relationship with other people and their friends, associates, to the point that other people might begin to disassociate with this individual because they can no longer tolerate their fixation. So they can actually begin to lose their job, lose their social ties, and become more socially isolated. So friends, family, coworkers might begin to notice an attitudinal change where the individual becomes single-minded about a topic. This is it's not someone that just happens to become interested in a hobby. It's something that they can kind of be angry about. So the passion isn't necessarily always positive. People will see the individual growing even more and more frustrated. Pictured here is the Virginia Tech shooter from about 2008. Remember, I was studying in England at the time. This was an offense that just really hit home because of being in university at the time. And in this case, you can see individual begins to get this pseudo-commando attitude. They begin to identify with somebody who is very knowledgeable about guns, about military tactics. They begin to adopt this warrior mentality and begin to closely align themselves with military culture. They might begin to buy law enforcement paraphernalia. With the Nova Scotia mass shooting we saw a couple summers ago, this was an individual that was willing to get RCMP decals illegally printed onto his own ghost cars that he had bought from auction. These are individuals that begin to identify with previous attackers. They might begin to heighten their search on the internet for people who have committed similar acts to the ones that they want to engage in, and they'll begin to identify as an agent of the cause or of a particular belief system. The novel aggression warning behavior isn't the actual violence that the individual intends to inflict on others. What it represents is almost like a trial. The individual may have been going to the gym, training with weapons, learning about weapons, and now they want to sort of test their ability to engage in an act of aggression. So it might be an act that actually has nothing to do with their ultimate intended target of the more serious and violent offense, but is again sort of looking at whether the individual feels like they have the ability to go and engage in this more serious crime. So it can be a measure of response tendency, so the motivation to act on the environment. It's like a tryout of the behavior that they intend to perpetrate. Pictured here is Elliot Rodger, and what's interesting about Rodger is that he wrote a very long manifesto. It should be available on the internet, and if I can, I'll post a copy of it to Canvas. And he had a lot of what we would this is before we really began to see the use of the term incel, but he might be an example of somebody who would have identified with an incel movement. He was jealous of a couple that was getting coffee at Starbucks, and he threw coffee at them. In a later incident, he threw coffee at two girls that were sitting at a bus stop, and he was angry at them for not smiling at them. He bought a super soaker, like one of those water guns, filled it with orange juice, and began to spray a group playing kickball at a park. And these were all, again, minor forms of aggression that he was doing to actually test out his ability to engage in the more serious attacks that he wanted to perpetrate. I believe he had actually gotten into a physical altercation with the group at the bus stop. He actually ended up breaking his own arm or own leg or something like that. kind of taught him that he didn't have the physical capabilities of engaging in violence, and this might have been why he began to purchase firearms and why he committed his offenses with firearms, because he didn't have that ability to actually bring harm to others through his own physical force. In the days prior to the offense, so leading up to the offense, does the individual appear to have a sudden adrenaline rush where they know they're about to carry out this action, and so they might have a lack of sleep, increased frequency or variety of their behavior. Even if these activities are innocuous, they might just be constantly on the move in the days or weeks prior to the attack. Basically, to identify this warning behavior, we need to have an understanding of what the individual's routine is generally like, and then how they behave in the days leading up to the offense. Recall Adam Lanza spent days sitting in his room. That was his normal period of activity would involve just sitting in his room playing video games. If we saw a sudden change in that routine activity, that might be the indication of an energy burst warning behavior. If they're suddenly going to the store, going on a run, getting in the car, going for a drive, running errands, all of these things that are not really typical of their day-to-day routine. So pictured here is Jared Loughner, who was involved in the attempted assassination of Congressman Gabrielle Giffords, I believe is in the Phoenix, Tucson, Arizona area. So again, this information about this individual was useful because people knew that he wasn't normally like this. But the evening before he committed this offense, he went to Walgreens or a drugstore to drop off film. Then he checked into a Motel 6 basically by midnight. Then by 2 a.m. he went to pick up the photos from the drugstore. He made another purchase at Walgreens. He called a friend at 4 o'clock in the morning. He went to the MySpace and posted a photo of him with a firearm saying goodbye, friends. He was, during that period of time, looking up information on assassins and lethal injection on the internet. By 6 a.m. he went back to Walgreens and another drugstore. He went to Walmart. He went to one Walmart, didn't find what he wanted, went to another Walmart. This is all a period of time when normally this individual would be asleep, but clearly his pattern of behavior has changed. So he was at Walmart, he bought a duffel bag and a diaper bag. He bought ammunition. He might have bought a bulletproof vest. He was stopped by a police officer actually later on for running a red light. He went home, so remember he was at the motel, then he went home where his father lived, and he got in a confrontation with his father about what was in the bag. Loughner ran away. He then went back to another drugstore, got in a cab, got the cab to a Safeway where he asked change from Safeway so that he could give the taxi driver an exact amount because he didn't want to tip the driver. And then 16 minutes after paying for his taxi ride, he began his shooting rampage in Arizona. So from the span of midnight till 10 hours later at 10 a.m., he had engaged in a real wide range of activities. The challenge though is how do we actually use this information to prevent the attack? So energy burst warnings, we might have to rely on family members or others who are online interacting with this individual, recognizing that this individual's behavior isn't really normal or routine. They're working outside of their normal hours. The leakage warning behavior isn't when an individual necessarily makes a direct threat or communicates a specific plan against a specific person or target. It's more like casual conversation to a third party about a general plan. It's usually transmitted over the internet, typically through social media or message boards, and it's limited to any communication that was known or could have been known prior to the actual violence. So it actually has to have happened much prior to the actual violence, and it's something that's, it's not just like a journal that an individual wrote in. It was actual communication to, say, a third party about a general plan or maybe an idea that they had. This is usually, if law enforcement is going to get involved in the investigation of the attack prior to the actual occurrence of the attack, if they know somebody, a specific person who might engage in a crime, this leakage warning behavior is when they will typically begin their investigation or when they become involved in the case. So pictured here is Yunus Abdullah Muhammad, also known as Jesse Curtis Morton. On April 20th, 2010, it was a website called Revolution Muslim. He posted a statement directed towards Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, saying that we have to warn Matt and Trey, basically that what they're doing is stupid, and they will probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh for airing this show. So this was in response, I believe, that South Park had aired an episode depicting a likeness of Muhammad. Theo Van Gogh worked for a French newspaper and was assassinated for drawing a cartoon depicting the image of Muhammad. So basically saying that Trey Parker and Matt Stone were going to end up like this previously assassinated person. The last resort warning behavior is where an individual believes that they've gone to the point of no return, that they now have to actually carry out the attack. There's no way that they can bring about their goals or their desires. So remember that fixation warning behavior is where they get obsessed with a particular topic and very angry about this topic or idea or belief. Now they're at the point where they think that the only way to achieve their goal is through violence. There's no other alternative. They feel trapped in this decision that they now have to go through the actions that they believe are necessary to change this desire, and that's the action of violence. It's not to say that other actions aren't available to the individual, but more that the individual ignores these or doesn't see them as viable alternatives, things that are plausible for them. So pictured here is Dylan Roof, who held extremely racist values. This was again somebody from the United States who said basically that he had no choice, not a position to make any change. He chose Charleston because it was a historic site of African American fight for equality, and at one point in time had the highest ratio of blacks to whites in the country. So he saw this as a place that he wanted to attack because he believed that there was no skinheads, no KKK to fight back against what he wanted to see, which was a homogenous culture of white only. And he felt that there was nobody out there to really do any of this change, so he felt that he had to take it upon himself to make the change, and he ended up shooting and driving a car, killing several people. And lastly, we'll look at the directly communicated threat warning behavior. This is actually one that is not as common as the others, but it's a way for law enforcement not just to begin their investigation, but to actually identify who the perpetrator definitely is and who the victim or the target definitely is. It's a threat usually written on the internet, but it also could be an oral communication through like a telephone call to police, basically saying that they intend to damage, kill, or injure a particular target or symbol. Again, it's somewhat rare, with the exception of people who've had prior sexual relationships. Malloy says that in such cases, you can see an increased likelihood the individual will directly communicate their threat towards this person. Timur Abdul Wahab al-Abdali was one individual who phoned the Syria security police, or the police received an email from him basically that included an audio message saying that your children, your daughters, your sisters are all going to die. So that's the different pathways that an individual will go through before a serious and violent offense, according to Malloy. The different warning signs they will show along these different steps. So that's it for our week on describing violence. We'll talk to everybody next week.